All right, so the text says, Job was a good and a godly man. It says in Job 1 verse 1, it says he was blameless and upright. Now, this was a man who was beyond reproach. Now, no one could make a charge against him in any area of his life. You see, he was a caring husband and a father and a man deeply devoted to God, just and compassionate in all his dealings. And on top of it, successful and very, very rich. Okay? He is said to have been the greatest man in the East. Job 1 verse 3 says. Each of his children had their own house, which was a little bit unusual at that time, and were engaged in constant feasting. You know, the Bible likes to highlight the fact that, they were partying all the time. Why, I do not know. All right? But it was a sign of the family's prosperity. Okay? But suddenly, this very good man is overtaken by a series of disasters in which he loses his wealth, his family, and health. Now, why? In Job 1, 6-8, it says, we are shown a great heavenly counsel, like what the overview said just now. All right? With God and the angels, and with, I don't know why they say Satan, yeah, Pastor Andrew. Later on the Q&A, we will explain how come they call it Satan instead of Satan. All right? With Satan present. Okay? Now, God points to Job as his finest servant. There is no one like him on earth, it says. A man who fears God and shuns evil. Now, Satan, and his name means accuser, immediately charges Job with a kind of hypocrisy. Now, he reacts angrily when God calls Job his servant. And this is what the text says. Now, this is what Satan says. Does Job fear God for nothing? He hisses. All right? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now, stretch out your hand and strike everything that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Satan is saying that Job is in his relationship with God merely for the benefits. He doesn't serve and love you. Satan is arguing. He's only loving himself, serving himself, and using you to do it. You are just an instrument, a means to an end. I'll prove it to you and to this council. Make things unprofitable for him. Stop blessing him. And you will see he'll drop you like a hot stone. Satan is saying, for Job, obeying God is just an exercise in self-love and self-salvation. If the earthly benefits of serving God were removed, then Job would be revealed for what he is. But ultimately, what he wanted to do was to attack God. Job, you see, is the finest servant God has ever had. If he is indeed a fake, a phony, then it means God has completely failed to make any man or woman into his loving servants. You see, Satan, yeah? I stopped saying Satan, yeah? Satan is easier, yeah? Satan. Satan is Hebrew. I'm not Hebrew, I'm Chinese, okay? All right. You see, the problem is Satan hates the good. And he hates God, really hates God. And so his motives are completely evil. He enjoys inflicting pain and he wants to see people suffer. And he knows the heart of love God has for the human race. So he wants to defeat God's purpose of turning his people into great and joyous worshippers of him. He wants to frustrate the great desire of God's heart. And so God allows Satan to test Job. Why? I believe it meant that God knew Job already loved him. You see, most of the time, God knows you already love him. And yet, there was still a need for Job's love to be refined in a way that would do enormous good down through history. See, the suffering was allowed to bring Job to a level of greatness. But that also means that Satan had a point. There's a difference between being religious externally and having true love, devotion internally for God. You see, that gap is to some degree in us all. And it is one of the reasons we don't have the intimacy with God and the peace and joy in Him that we should. So what is a real servant of God? Well, think of any love relationship, okay? What if you fell in love with someone who seemed to love you back? But then when you face financial difficulties, he or she broke off that relationship. Wouldn't you feel used? Wouldn't you think the person loved the things you could give him or her rather than loving you for yourself? It's no different with God. We should love him for himself alone, not for the benefits that he brings. And how do you develop a love like that? You know, when you initially fall in love with a person, yeah? Okay, if you're honest, all right, it was partly because of some of the person's assets, correct or not? You know, correct or not? Correct, right? I mean, how many of you marry your husband and boyfriend or girlfriend, right? I mean, 哇，你很丑啊，我很喜欢你啊。But you really ugly, really like, you know, right? I mean, definitely got some assets one, you know, either muscle very big lah, or very smart lah, or I don't know, look like a Korean movie star lah, you know. Most of the times because of certain assets, all right? So I say looks lah, you know, some of them connections, or rich, okay? 不用帅啦，最重要有钱哈 okay? Something like that, okay? But as the relationship progresses, you begin to love the person for himself, herself alone. And then, when some of those assets go away, you don't mind. We call that growth in love and character. You see, now what if you grew in your love like that? I mean, in your love for God like that. What if you could grow in your love for him so that he became increasingly satisfying in himself to you? Now, that would mean that the circumstances wouldn't affect you that much, since you had God and his love enriching and nourishing you regardless of the circumstances in life. Now, how can we get there? How can you move from loving God? In the Bible commentary says, like to say the word mercenary, all right? Now, mercenary means, you like someone only for benefits, okay? When you say that somebody is normally they used to describe mercenaries as soldiers, yeah? You are a soldier of fortune, all right? That means you protect the country only because if somebody pays you. All right, so that's what is the meaning of mercenary, all right? We don't love God in a mercenary way. That means if there's benefits, all right, to loving God himself. Okay? Now, I'm afraid the primary way is to have hardship come into your life. You see, suffering helps you to assess yourself, yeah? And see the mercenary nature of your love for God. When your most cherished things are taken away from you, you may be tempted to angrily reject him. But then, suffering gives you an opportunity. Now, instead of giving up on God and moving away from him, you could adjust and focus on him in a way you had never done before. You see, God uses difficulties and hardships to turn believers from mercenary followers into people who serve him out of love. You see, God knew that Satan was wrong about Job, but he also knew that Satan was also right. Okay, let me say that again. God knew that Satan was wrong about Job, but he also knew that Satan was also right. You see, Job was not fully the servant he should be and could be, and God was going to enable him to attain that kind of greatness the only way it can be attained, through adversity and pain. You see, Job would become more fully someone who serves God for nothing and loves God for himself alone. And so, God willed to show the host of heaven, as well as the hundreds of millions of people and readers, all right, that read the book of Job, that he can make human beings into loving servants. And so God gives Satan permission to bring pain and suffering into Job's life. In chapter 1, he says that Satan can take away Job's things, but not touch his body. While in the second chapter, he allows Satan to send Job painful diseases, but not take his life. You see, when we read this, right, we feel very uncomfortable, we cringe, when we read God granting this to Satan. But again, we must not miss the main point of this action. It conveys in detail the relationship of God and evil. Now, what do I mean by that? You see, in the book of Job, there is no, okay, this is a big word, right? Because there's no dualistic view, all right, of the world, all right, in which there are two equal opposite forces, all right? In the book of Job, there's no, the world, yeah, it's not made up of two equal forces, all right? Equal and opposite forces of good and evil. Because if that is the case, life will be a battlefield between good and evil, all right, with no clear winner, okay? With no clear winner, all right? But the Bible shows us no such world, all right? According to the Bible, it is not like this, all right? God is completely in charge. You see, he has total control over Satan. Now, Satan can only go so far and no further. God clearly is sovereign. But on the other hand, the book of Job shows that even though God does not inflict all the suffering on Job, he allows it for a greater purpose. You see, this is a brilliant way to get across the truth that nothing happens outside of God's plan. That he, God, has ultimate control over history, even as he does not enjoy seeing people suffer. You see, evil and suffering are not God's original intent for the world, and therefore only a temporary condition until its renewal. You see, the first disasters that come upon Job are the loss of his wealth and also of his children. You see, Job's response to express great grief, but nonetheless to also bow and to worship him, saying famously, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has also taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." You see, Job's response is emotionally, right, very real and very raw. You see, he got up and he tore his robes. Again, later on you can ask, why is it that last time people, when they always like to tear, David also like to tear off his robes, all right? Job also like to tear off his robes. I also don't know why. But probably it's just the way they express their real emotions, okay? So it's very real and very raw. And he got up and he tore his robe and he fell to the ground. He shows a proper gratitude to God. He said, "The Lord gave." And also appropriate deference, all right? Which means his submission and also respect, all right? He says, "The Lord has taken away." And so we might say, first round, the winner goes to Job, all right? Job wins, Satan loses, all right? But when Job loses his health as well, all right? He goes on, Job loses his health. This time, he can no longer maintain that composure anymore. You see, in verse 23, he says, he blames God for all his troubles, though he does not curse God and die. As his wife counsels him in verse 2, verse 9. He does not turn away from God or contemplate suicide, but he also struggles greatly with what he feels like grave injustice. You see, friends, when you lived a life of goodness, like Job, all right, obedient, God-fearing, and righteous, like a lot of us, it makes affliction even harder for a person to take and to swallow. Because it all seems so completely senseless and unfair. Amen? And so the middle chapters of the book of Job consist of 3 long cycles of speeches by Job's friends. Eliphaz, okay, it says this now, Bildad, and Zophar, who come to comfort him, all right? I make it easier, all these Hebrew names, all right? I call them the Tuck brothers, okay? Let me explain to you how come the Tuck brothers, okay? 一個講得，一個吹得，一個唱得, okay? All right, so the Tuck brothers, okay, we call them 3 of them, all right? But their counsel, all right, hurts Job very much. You see in chapter 4, all right, a speech by Eliphaz, all right, 或者講得, okay? 大哥我哋想講得, okay? It's a simple example, all right, of their basic approach. Now he says this, all right? Consider now, 你想一下, okay? Who, being innocent, has ever perished? 谁无辜的有死过的? 你想一下. So he's telling Job, okay? 你想一下, 谁无辜的有死过的? All right? Where were the upright ever destroyed? Let me think in Chinese. 有谁正直的正直的被毁灭过的？你想一下。As I have observed, 照我看 okay? Those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. 你做坏事，也是你做坏事 okay? I don't know how to say sow evil, right? Okay? Those who plow evil and those who sow evil, 应得的 okay? You deserve it. That's what he's trying to say, okay? All right, so the message of Job's friends is clear. Job wouldn't be suffering like this unless he had failed to pray, trust, and obey God in some way. You see, God would never be so unjust as to let all of this happen unless Job had done something wrong to deserve it. So if Job wants to be restored, he simply needs to confess all his known sins to get his life straight again. So he's basically saying, 就是因为你没有祷告咯， You never pray, right? That's a problem. You never trust in God, right? You never obey God, right? That's why you're like this, no? See, friends. Right? So tell your neighbor, right? With friends like this, who needs enemies? Correct or not? Eliphaz conduct, okay? But Eliphaz's speech is not totally untrue. You think about it. It's actually not totally untrue. In fact, it is actually quite close to conventional religious beliefs. Now, he says many things that are in abstract, actually quite true one, biblically. All right? You see, what do I mean by that, all right? There's actually a moral order in this universe one, correct? Moral order, all right? Now, it is true that sooner or later, bad behavior can lead to painful consequences, correct? All right? 你做坏事, there will be consequences, all right? Now, we should trust God and not always assume that we are in the right. And if we come into the time of trouble, we should humble ourselves before God and examine ourselves. You see, as we have noted before, we might be in a position of David or Jonah, all right? God had to, in a sense, bring a difficulty to David and Jonah, all right, to let them realize their mistake, all right, and turn, okay? Maybe God is trying to wake us up. True one, actually, all right? And Eliphaz says to Job in chapter 5, verse 17, he says, "Blessed is a man that God corrects. Do not despise the discipline of the Almighty." That, again, is true. 没有错啊. But as they say, true words are thin. Listen, for a man in difficulty. All right? So when somebody is going through difficulty, all right, you go and say this sort of thing to him. You know, I mean, if you're not helping him. All right? So this is the kind of friends Job is having. Okay? And so even though Job's friends can piece together strings of technically true statements, right? All the statements are technically true, and their mistakes stem from an inadequate understanding of the grace of God. You see, their theology, right, is very moralistic. Eliphaz says, hardship does not spring forth from the soil, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. He means that suffering doesn't happen naturally. It only happens if you live wrongly and bring it on yourself. But here he shows an ignorance of the teaching of Genesis in Genesis 3, verse 16, where God says, because of sin, thistles and thorns will come out of the ground for everyone. In other words, the world is broken by sin. And bad things do happen to people, regardless of how well they live. See, Job's friends, therefore, have a view of God that is very, very limited. There is never a mystery. To them, right, everything is very black and white, okay? 就不是这样子，就是那个样子. If life goes well, it is because you are living rightly. If life does not go well for you, it must be your fault. All right? So, they're very simplistic, and very moralistic in their view of the world. But this puts God, feels like you can control God. Moralistic theology feels like you are able to control, right? It puts God on a leash. Why? Because to put God under obligation to a human morality is a threat to his sovereignty. In other words, right, a moralistic person like Eliphaz believes God can be managed with morality. His advice to Job is this: you push the right buttons, you confess all your known sins, straighten up, you fly straight, fly right, and everything will be good for you, guaranteed. See, Job does not take his friends' insensitivity, right, and being very cruel technically, lying down. All right, his response in chapter 6 is emotionally very real. He knows his friend's limited view of God is wrong, yet neither will he simply curse and reject God as unjust. You see, to go in either the traditional religious or the irreligious direction would have been the easier way to go. But he will not take either. As a result, his agony is enormous. This is what he says: if only my anguish could be weighed, and all my misery be placed on scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. You see, I really love the way he cries out to God, right? Prayer is really being able to be real to God. Amen? So, as you read the book of Job, right, I want you to be able to experience and sense, the way he cries out to God. It's very real. It should show us a model of the way that, when you're going through suffering, right, or when you go through difficulties, right, this is the way that you should pray. to God, cry out to God. Amen? Okay? So, he says, no wonder my words have been impetuous. Very big words there, yeah? But just be patient a bit, all right? The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me. You see, he's so fierce that he will speak unworthy of his God that he imagines it might be better to die before he can do so. So in spite of it, right, he's also very fearful of saying things that will be disrespectful to God. Okay? This is what he says. He says, oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life. Then I will still have this consolation, my joy in unrelenting pain, that I had not denied the words of the Holy One. But also, again, he's also brutally honest with his friends about what he thinks of their counsel. He says this, anyone who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty, but my brothers are as undependable as intermittent streams. Teach me, and I will be quiet. Show me where I have been wrong. How painful are honest words. But what do your arguments prove? Do you mean to correct what I say? And treat my desperate words as wind. Relent. Do not be unjust. Reconsider, for my integrity is at stake. Is there any wickedness on my lips? Can my mouth not discern malice? You see, Job's sarcastic responses to his friends are very classic, all right? Miserable comforters, you all. And he says, doubtless you are the only people who matter. 你们全部讲都是对的咯. And wisdom will die with you. All right, so he's very straightforward with them. And so for many chapters, Job and his three friends engage in a heated, extensive dialogue and debate about the meaning of Job's suffering. Now, in Job's speeches, he not only debates with his friends, but also cries out to God, asking the perennial question of sufferers, why this? And why me? Now, eventually, another figure appears, a younger man named Elihu, all right? Who criticizes both Job and the other friends, and his other friends also, right? Now, interest builds as it becomes clear that neither Job nor his friends seem to be winning or seeing the ways of God clearly. Many of his friends seem to be winning or seeing the way, many of the things that the friends say seem to be winning. Now, many of the things that Job says also seems to be right at the same time. Now, who is right? And who will win? And what does God think? And so just now the overview says, right, the prologue and the middle chapters of the book of Job reveal to the reader that Job's sufferings are not intended as punishment. All right, this is a very important point, all right? Now, Job's sufferings are not intended as punishment. They are not retribution for Job's personal sin, but they are also not corrective. They are not designed to wake Job to a particular mistaken path or to bring him back to a faith from a wandering path. Slowly but surely, it emerges that the purpose of Job's suffering is an enlarged life with God. Now, this is the only possible reason for it because Job led a devout life. See, Job was obedient, he was righteous, right? He was devout. Now, you see, if Job agreed with his friends that this was punishment or correction for some specific sin, he would have missed the real purpose and benefit of what he was going through. You see, Job was called to live on a deeper level. Job shows that he has an inkling of this, he has an idea of this, all right? Through all the speeches and on all his prayers, Job repeatedly states his desire to meet God and hear him directly. Now, at the end of the book, his desire is granted, but not in the way he expected. When God actually does appear to speak to Job in the final chapters of the book, there are 4 great shocks and 4 surprises. The first one is this. The Lord appears and Job lives. What do I mean by that? See, the first surprise is that God does indeed finally show up in chapter 38. All right? Chapter 1 all the way to chapter 37. God actually never shows up. All right? For 37 chapters, Job was actually crying out to God, complaining to God. All right? Screaming out to God. And God never answers him until chapter 38. All right? He finally does answer Job. But he takes a menacing form. All right? The Bible says, as a storm. Yet he does not destroy Job. At first, the harsh words, the very strong words, all right, lead us to think God is about to judge Job severely. You see, he says very loudly, it's like a thunder, right? He says God thunders. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstones? You see, but despite this strong, challenging language, God has not come to judge or to crush Job, but rather to reach out to him in grace. Now, what do I mean by that? Right? This is very important. The first indication of this is the sudden appearance of the Hebrew personal name called Yahweh. All right? Translated into English as the Lord. Now, if you look at the slide here, right? Okay? In verse 1, right? 38 verse 1. Okay? That's the English version. But in Hebrew, actually, is the word Yahweh that comes out, which has been almost completely absent from the book of Job until now. Now, see, Yahweh is the same God revealed to Moses in the burning bush when he calls to him. It is the personal, intimate revelation of his name that God gives to those in a covenantal love relationship with him. It is Yahweh who now speaks to Job. Also, we are told that Yahweh answered Job out of the storm. This phrase, as generic as it looks to us in English, is actually very, very significant. See, many readers look as God's speech. Look at God's speech to Job as a rude mocking of him. Right? It's like God scolding him, and mocking him. But when God shows up, he enters into a dialogue with him. He does not come to simply denounce Job. He actually gives Job a chance to reply. A final word on chapter 42, verse 1 to 6, all right? In other words, God is inviting Job into a relationship. As much as he's scolding him, all right? As much as he's angry with him, he's also inviting him to a personal relationship with him. Nevertheless, despite the intimacy of the name Yahweh and the mode of address, God appears to Job in a storm, literally, all right? A storm wind. Now, Asian people knew nothing more terrifying or more scary or more destructive than a hurricane. You see, if you remember, Job's children had been destroyed by by a hurricane. Job was afraid of that too. He was actually afraid that if God actually did appear to him, he would crush him with a storm. And indeed, when God does show up, he comes in the most fierce, overwhelming, majestic storm possible, as a storm king. Now, Job would expect that God, in this form, would immediately destroy him. But actually, he does not. When God appears on Mount Sinai, no one could approach or even touch the mountain lest they die. But here, God's very presence appears before Job, and he actually lives. And so this is the paradox, then. You see, God comes both as a gracious personal God, but also as an infinite, overwhelming force, both at the same time. How can this be? You see, only in Jesus Christ do we see how an untamable God, an infinite God, all right, can become a baby and also a loving Savior. You see, on the cross, we see how both the love and the holiness of God can be fulfilled both at once. You see, God is so holy and just that Jesus had to die for our sins. Otherwise, we could not be forgiven. But he was also so filled with love for us that he laid down his life willingly. See, the gospel then explains how God can be both God of love and also of fury that Job meets on that dark, stormy day. Secondly, it says, the Lord does not answer, yet does. You see, the second surprise is that God's long speeches do not at first glance, address any of the concerns of Job or his friends at all, even though the text says God answers Job. You see, Job expected an explanation. He expected an explanation from God. God, I need to explain to me why am I going through this suffering, all right? But Job's friends expected a condemnation, all right? His friends actually expected God to condemn him. You see, but at the end of the day, they actually get neither, all right? Instead, God gives us a long poetic discourse, about the wonders of the natural world. Now, before looking at the speeches themselves, we must stop and weigh the significance of the fact that God gives Job no explanation for what happened to him. He says nothing about Satan or the heavenly council. He gives no reason why he allowed Satan to bring suffering upon Job. It wouldn't have been hard for God to do this. You see, he could have said something like this to Job, all right? Job, I know it has been painful for you, but you must realize that because of all of this, you will become great and someday be an inspiration to hundreds of millions of sufferers until the very end of time. All right? No one except my own son will be better known for patience under affliction. Amen? You see, if he had said this, if God had actually said this to Job, Job might have said, oh, okay, if that's the case, then it's different, I guess if that is the outcome, it put things in a different light, and it would have made his suffering a little bit more easier, If somebody actually explains to you, okay, Andrew, this is the reason why you are suffering, because one day, there's a purpose, there's a blessing. It's going to be an example for people. If you know about this, right, you can actually, suffering would have been easier for you, all right, if there's a reason why. But the truth of the matter is, God says nothing. God actually never said anything to him, all right? So it is one of the many excellences of the book of Job, of the book of Job is that, it is brought to a contentment without ever knowing, that Job is brought to contentment without ever knowing all the facts of his case. Because the test would only work if Job did not know what it was for. You see, God thrust Job into an experience of abandonment, shame, and loss, to make it possible for Job to enter into a life of naked faith, to learn to love God for himself alone. Now, God does not seem to give this privilege to many people, for they pay a terrible price for suffering for their discoveries. But part of the discovery is to see the suffering itself as one of God's most precious gifts. You see, to withhold the full story from Job, even after the test was over, keeps him walking by faith and not by sight. Now, he does not say in the end, now I see it all. Because he never sees it all. But he sees God. See, perhaps it is better if God never tells any of us the whole of our life story. You see, the accusation of Satan was that Job did not actually love or serve God. He was loving and serving himself through compliance with God's will. And we have said that this is always partly true of even the best of God's followers. But it's because we don't fully love God just for his own sake that we are subject to such great ups and downs, depending on how things go in our lives. You see, we do not find our hearts fully satisfied with God unless other things are also going well. And therefore, we are without sufficient roots. We are not deep, easily blown and beaten by the winds of changing circumstances. But to grow into a true, free lover of God, who has the depth of joy, knowing, who has that depth, all right? To be a true Christian of depth, we have to go through, a kind of a stripping. What do I mean by that? We must feel that to obey God will bring us no benefits at all. It is at that point that seeking, praying to, and obeying God begins to change us. And so the expanded life with God that Job eventually receives can come to him only by God not telling him why he suffered. You see, God would have been, in a sense, cooperating, or feeding Job's impulse for self-justification, had he given him those reasons. Instead, the experience of suffering leads Job to the place where he loves and trusts him simply because he is God. See, Job becomes a person of enormous strength and joy, who does not need good circumstances or favorable circumstances in his life in order to stand straight spiritually. Now, this makes the suffering, or more accurately, the results of suffering, a very great gift indeed. And it's very doubtful that this level of reliance on the grace of God can ever be gotten in any other way. You see, Job never sees the whole picture. He only sees God. But that's what we really need for all eternity. And so there is another crucial reason for God to not give Job any explanation for his suffering. Satan had said that Job was a fake, that he lived morally and obeyed God only for the personal benefits. You see, Satan wanted to not only bring pain on Job, but also to discredit him, to expose him as a fraud. But God allowed Satan only enough space to accomplish the very opposite of what Satan had wanted. You see, we may be upset when we read that God gave Satan permission to attack Job, correct? But we should keep in mind that Satan's attack in the end gave Job a name that will live forever, made him one of the most famous men in history. If you knew, all right, if you knew that 3,000 years later, millions of people will be using your phone or your iPad. Wow, you're sleepy already. I'm really sleepy already. That was meant to be a joke, okay? Okay, just testing you all, right? Okay. If you knew, okay? Okay, everyone awake, okay? All right, everyone awake, okay? If you knew that 3,000 years later, millions of people will be reading about and discussing your words and deeds, you could consider yourself successful. And in allowing Satan to inflict Job with suffering, God only created one of the great resources in the history of the world, all right, which has inspired countless sufferers to face adversity with endurance and also patience. And so God allows evil just enough space to defeat itself. See, the story of Job is a smaller version of what God is doing in your life in the history of the world. You see, God has now mapped out a plan for history that includes evil as part of it. See, this is a very important point, all right? See, God has now mapped out a plan for history that also includes evil as part of it. When we hear this, this makes us confused and very angry, But then, the story of Job pulls back the veil for just an instant and shows us that God will allow evil only to the degree that it brings about the very opposite of what it intends. And so the Lord is God, and we are not. See, in the final speeches, the Lord calls Job to consider the creation of the world, to make a point that humans have very finite knowledge of all God has put into creation. He depicts the great oceans of the world as just a helpless baby to him. He talks about the sunrise and the sunset, the depths of the earth to the heights above the earth, snow, rain, hail, lightning, even to the stars. See, God has created and knows all about them. But does Job know? After that, God talks about all the great wild animals, the lion, the raven, the mountain goat, and the deer. God does not draw moral lessons from the animals, all right? They are simply to show Job God's work of art. They show the wisdom, the joy, the power, and the beauty of the Creator himself. See, the point is this. We are not God. His knowledge and power is beyond ours. And so the first speech ends in Job 40, verse 2, with the Lord's question, Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? And then God also reprimands Job for thinking of himself as the judge of the world in order to justify himself. He says to Job, do you have an arm like mine? Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like mine? Unleash the fury of your wrath. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. You see, so now we see that God had been driving. Now we see what God had been driving, as he pointed out the wonders of the created order. See, Job was arguing that he could run the universe better than God. And so God drives home the point to Job that he does not have the ability, that he does not have the power to be the judge. He does not have the right. God tells him to drop the claims, to hand the whole matter over completely to God, more trustingly, without complaining. And to do it without insisting that God should answer all his questions. And so, friends, this is actually the way of wisdom. To willingly, not begrudgingly, admit that God alone is God. Because the alternate is to become evil yourself. Now, why do I mean by that? Think about it. See, imagine you had the power to run the universe, to do whatever you want, to do whatever you will, to unleash the fury of your wrath, to crush those we think have done wrong, to bury all of them in the dust, like what the verse says. It is human nature to be eager to use force to fight what we think is evil and bad. Am I right? But it is by such destructive acts that we become evil. We will take over the role of God, and we would become like Satan. You see, friends, only God can destroy creatively. Only God can transmute or transform evil, whether it is suffering, whether it is setbacks, whether it is sorrows, whether it is unfairness, injustice, into something good. And so this, my friends, is the heart of the theology of the book of Job. And finally, number 4. Job is in the right and we are in the wrong. And this is the 4th surprise. Now, we said that Job expected an explanation from God, correct? He wanted God to explain to him, why am I going through this suffering? All right? But his friends expected God to condemn Job as a sinner. Must be because something wrong that he did. Instead, God is completely finished with his speeches. When God is completely finished with his speeches, he turns to the 3 friends, right? The Gong Tak, Chong Tak, and Chui Tak. Okay? Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. All right? Telling them that they and their legalistic, self-justifying retribution theology has been in the wrong. And Job, my servant, has been in the right. And his insistence that he is an innocent sufferer. God then says that Job must pray for them if they are to escape divine punishment. This part of the story leads many modern readers to wonder, why would God be so affirming of Job? See, God cursed the day he was born, challenged God's wisdom, cried out and complained bitterly, expressed deep doubts. He didn't see that Job was a role model it was a role model actually, right, of steady faith throughout. Why would God vindicate him like that? See, the first reason is that God is gracious and forgiving. But the crucial thing is this. The crucial thing to notice is this. Through it all, Job never stopped praying. Yes, he complained, but he complained to God. Yes, he doubted, but he doubted to God. And yes, he did scream and yell, but he did it in God's presence. No matter how much agony he was in, he continued to address God, and he kept seeking him. And in the end, God said Job triumphs. Job won. How wonderful that our God sees the grief and the anger and the questioning, and is still willing to say, you triumphed and you won. Not because it was all fine, not because Job's heart and motives were always right, but because Job's perseverance in seeking the face and the presence of God meant that suffering did not drive him away from God, but actually towards him, closer to him. And that made all the difference. See, John Newton says this, if you are not getting much out of going to God in prayer, you will certainly not get nothing out of staying away. Let me say that again. If you are not getting much out of going to God in prayer, you will certainly get nothing out of staying away from him. Now, this is perhaps the single most concrete and practical thing we can learn from the book of Job. The Bible says that God is near to the brokenhearted. He upholds all who fall and lifts up those who are bowed down. Those are universal truths. See, God is near and cares about all of us. In addition, he promises to help Christians with his Spirit. And he says to believers in Christ, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. Jesus says that we are his sheep and no one will snatch them out of my hand. All this means that if we cannot feel God in our darkest and most dry times, he is still there. And so there is no more basic way to face suffering than this. Like Job, we must seek him. Go to him. Pray even when you are dry. Read the Bible, read the scriptures, even when you are going through a lot of pain and suffering. Because eventually, you will sense him again. And the darkness, right, won't last forever. The strength you need for suffering comes in the doing of the responsibilities and duties that God requires. Now, do not avoid the commands of God. Read, pray, study, fellowship, serve, witness, obey. Do all the duties that you physically can, and the God of peace will be with you. Amen? And finally, my servant Job again. See, Job gives his final reply to God in Job 42, verse 2 to 6. He says this, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things that I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. You see, it is clear, from the grammar and the words, that this is an act of worship, not an angry bitterness against God. See, for Job calls God wonderful in verse 3. His opening lines are an exclamation, all right? He says an exclamation, all right? You can do all things. None of your plans can be stopped. You see, Job finally admits that his demands had not taken into consideration the wonder of who God is. He also admits that God has plans behind everything that happens, even if those plans are hidden. Now, to what do we owe this change of tone and this new sense of discovery? See, Job says that originally he heard of God with the ears. See, originally he says, I heard God with my ears, but now my eyes have seen you. See, this means that at first, all the abstract, all the concepts, all right, of God's power, His majesty, and might, had not really gripped his heart. We often hear about, we always come to church, all right? We always hear about how good God is, how big God is, how great God is, all right? But very often, it doesn't really sink into our hearts. Amen? All right? But God's appearance and all the difficulties that he went through, all the suffering, right? And God's speeches and appearance, right? Had finally brought all of this home to him. It had shaken him out of his desire for self-justification. His insistence on explanation and public vindication. And out of his belief that he knew better than God what needed to happen. And so the change in Job is both spiritual and also deep theologically, all right? This whole thing changed him spiritually as well as theologically, all right? Job finally says, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. You see, in the original Hebrew, the word myself is not there actually, all right? Look at the verse, all right? The word Hebrew, in the original Hebrew, the word myself is not there. And repent can also mean retract, all right? Therefore, the verse should be read better, something like this, right? I despise and retract what I said. I take back everything I said. And I feel really sorry for what I said, God. Right? So, what does this mean? Job finally abandons his self-justification project. He abandons all his effort in trying to justify himself. He retracts his very demand that God must give him an explanation and public to be vindicated publicly. All right? He gives up trying to control God. He stops mistrusting God in any way. He bows before God and lets him be who he is. He serves God for himself alone. You see, friends, if you notice, in the entire book of Job, God's long speeches are filled with a lot of very strong words, all right, reminding Job of his finite humanness. But they do not contain any statements of Job's sins. You see, God never says anything about any sins bringing on Job's suffering. God never mentions anything, that about Job's sins, that caused his sufferings. And so this is the fact, right? Though Job never learns the reasons for the strategy, for his tragedy, okay? He also learns something crucial for his peace of mind. The fact that God does not come forward, as his friends did, with a list of Job's sins showed that this was really not needed. It didn't really matter to God. God appeared to Job in a terrifying storm, yet also as Yahweh, without any accusation, without accusing him of anything. This means that God loves and accepts him, that his unusual suffering is not punishment for his unusual sin. And so the very lack of condemnation means that Job is right with God. In effect, God is saying, this should be enough for you, Job. And it is. You see, God's great silence about Job's sin is a tremendous assurance of his love and acceptance for us, no matter what it looks like to the world. You see, we can trust God's grace and not our own righteousness, or try to figure out and make sense when things are confusing or beyond our control. Amen? And one last thing. You see, friends, Job was an innocent sufferer, all right? The whole story of Job is about a man that suffered innocently. But you see, there is another man who was far more than Job. This man was willing to live the life of Job to its ultimate conclusion. This man was willing to die while considered by his friends and enemies to be a fool, a blasphemer, even a criminal, powerless to save himself. You see, Job was naked, penniless, and in physical pain. This man was homeless, stripped naked, and also tortured. See, while Job was relatively innocent, all right? Relatively innocent. This man was absolutely and perfectly innocent. Job felt God abandoning him. This man actually felt the real absence of God, as well as the betrayal of his friends and the loss of his family. This man saw that if he obeyed God fully, he'd be absolutely abandoned by God and essentially destroyed in hell. No one else has ever faced such a situation. Only one man truly served God for nothing. Job was tested by Satan, and he refined his love for God. This man was assaulted by Satan, and in the greatest act of love, made the ultimate sacrifice to bring God's salvation to humankind. Friends, this man was the ultimate Job, and his name is Jesus, our Savior, our Redeemer, and our Lord. Amen. Amen. Praise God. Praise God. And thus is the book of Job, friends.